Hello and welcome to Fantastic Fights, the podcast about a middle-aged man playing adventure gamebooks out loud on the internet. My name is Hieronymus J. Doom and this is another bonus episode of the podcast made possible by the generosity of my patrons over on patreon.com/HJDoom. If you'd like to support the production of this podcast by joining that august body, you'll also snag yourself a lovely haul of bonus content, including no less than 5 different gamebooks written by myself and my lovely husband. This episode was suggested to me by listener Oliver Robertson, and I'm delighted that he did because it's a gamebook set in the wonderful world of Asterix, as created by René Goscinny and Albert Uderzo. Asterix was a big part of my childhood, and I've retained a tremendous fondness for the plucky Gaul and his collection of misfit friends and enemies. I'm sure most of my listeners are entirely familiar with Asterix, but in case there's anyone who missed out, I'll give a very quick history. Asterix the Gaul are a series of satirical comics which began way back in 1959 but have continued to be published into the present day. They tell a story set nominally in the year 50 BC, a time at which Julius Caesar has conquered all of Gaul, the lands that would later become France. Did I say all of Gaul? I misspoke, for a single small village on the coast still resists Roman rule. That village has a secret weapon, a magic potion brewed by the druid Getafix, which provides the imbiber with superhuman strength temporarily. With this potion, they are able to keep to their old way of life in defiance of Rome's efforts to subdue them. The village is populated by a colourful cast of eccentric characters, from Asterix himself, a short but wily warrior, his enormous best friend Obelix, who fell into a cauldron of the magic potion as a baby and is permanently strong off the back of it. There's also Obelix's scrappy terrier Dogmatix, the wise druid Getafix, the wildly incompetent bard Cacophonix, and sundry other folk such as the fishmonger Unhygienix and his wife Bacteria, the venerable chief Vital Statistics and his wife Impedimentia. Much of the humour of the comics comes from the affectionate portrayals of national stereotypes and then mashing that up with the popular history of the Roman period. When our heroes visit Britain, for example, they find an island of people who drink warm beer and boil everything in sight to a uniform shade of grey. Also, work has just begun on digging a tunnel to link Britain and Gaul, the Channel Tunnel having been constantly in progress for what seemed like forever at the time of the book's release. There's also something of a Flintstones vibe to some elements of the stories, with humour coming from the insertion of modern ideas into the ancient world. There's a wonderful story, one of my favourites, where the Romans hit on the idea of defeating the village by aggressive gentrification. They build luxury flats in the area around the village, and the sudden influx of the affluent middle classes threatens to economically undermine the Gauls' traditional way of life. There's also a lot, and I mean a lot, of silly puns. Asterix books are often held up as a shining example of the translator's art, with enormous care being taken to translate the feel of the jokes, rather than a strict word-for-word rendition of the original French. The books were arguably at their best before original writer René Goscinny's death in 1977. The artist Albert Uderzo continued the series on his own, and his artwork only got better until his retirement in 2009, but he just wasn't the same calibre of writer as Goscinny. Apparently some of the most recent books have seen something of a return to form, but for most fans it's the first 24 books that provide the definitive Asterix experience. Asterix books have sold nearly 400 million units worldwide, which makes them one of the most successful comic books of all time. And this being the French comic industry rather than the US comic industry, the authors were actually compensated financially for their creations rather than being just tossed straight into the gutter. There's also a vast quantity of spin-off media, multiple films, both live action and animated, video games, and even a theme park. Perhaps it was inevitable that there would be also a gamebook or two in there as well. The Meeting of the Chieftains, part of the Alia Jacta Est, or the Die is Cast range, came out in 1988 when gamebooks were still very much all the rage. It's safe to say that Goscinny and Uderzo's input into this was fairly minimal. Hard to blame Goscinny for that, as he'd been dead for over a decade, but although there's plenty of art in this book, as you would hope for a book based on a famous comic series, I think the majority of it, possibly even all of it, is lifted from existing Asterix books and then recontextualised to make it fit into a new narrative. There's zero chance that Albert Uderzo actually wrote this himself. Apparently, it was written by an experienced game designer called Bruno Faiduti, though the credits just read Goscinny and Uderzo as usual. Jackson and Livingston would surely be proud. The story features Chief Vital Statistics' nephew, Just for Kicks, as the protagonist, who is one of the main characters in Asterix and the Normans, where he is a spoiled and cowardly rich kid from the big city who gets into various scrapes when the Normans come calling. On one level, it's a pity not to be playing Asterix and Obelix, but I think using a recognisable but secondary character does make sense. Most kids really want to hang out with their heroes more than to be their heroes, even if they might struggle to actually articulate that distinction. Even with superhero stories, I think the fantasy is more about having superpowers than about being a specific superhero. And the magic potion very much allows Just for Kicks to gain access to the super strength that characterises all of the Gauls in the village. With that being said, let's take a look at the rules. We get 3 stats at the start: skill, fighting fitness and charm. I think these are all fairly self-explanatory, which is handy because the rules text doesn't actually explain them. Each of them starts out at 10, and you then get 15 points to spread among them however you see fit. Testing stats works by rolling a number of dice indicated in the text and then trying to get lower than your stat. This could be a few dice or it could be a lot. It's really simple, but it works fine. There's also a handy page at the back which you can use to generate random numbers if you don't have a dice to hand. Fighting is incredibly straightforward as well. Each fighter takes it in turn to roll 1d6 and subtract the result from their opponent's relevant stat, which will usually be, but not always be, fighting fitness. First 1 to 0 is knocked out, and you generally get healed back up to full immediately after each fight, unless you're fighting multiple opponents, in which case you have to go into the second one with the same fighting fitness that you've ended the first fight with. Very simple, perhaps too simple, but honestly I'll take simple but functional over complicated but doesn't really work. It does mean that the fighter with the highest stat should win, but still leaves scope for the odd surprise, especially if the gulf between the stats isn't that big, so that's all fine. That's what you want really from a fighting system. You want to have a good idea of who's going to win, but not for it to be certain. There's a basic skill system as well. We get to choose a secondary aptitude at the start of the adventure, but we'll deal with that when we get there. You can carry up to 5 items in addition to your purse and your gourd of magic potion. A magic potion will let you win any physical fight without having to roll, so that's going to be quite handy. And you start with 5 doses of magic potion in your gourd. I've generated my version of Just for Kicks, who I've decided to call Just for Kicks because that's his name. He has a skill of 15, a fighting fitness of 20 and a charm of 10. I wanted him to be a version of the character who is most comfortable solving problems with his fists, and I also wanted him to have the natural winning personality of the average trust fund kid, so I boosted his fighting fitness a lot, his skill a bit, and left his charm at rock bottom. Okay, I think that's everything. Let's play The Meeting of the Chieftains. Chapter 1. On holiday from Lutetia. I did consider doing this adventure entirely in a cod French accent, but I think that might be illegal under the Geneva Convention, and certainly would not be a pleasant listening experience for anyone. Worn out with the pace of life in Lutetia, the traffic jams and the amphorinecks, ancient Gaulish bottlenecks, you have decided to take your father Double Helix's advice and go for a holiday in a little village in Armorica you already know well. On previous visits to the village, you could have learned business skills from unhygienics, livestock rearing from bucolics, hunting from obelix. Your experience of the nightlife in Lutetia may have given you a good head for drink. So I get to choose one of these 4 secondary aptitudes: business skill, livestock rearing, hunting, or a good head for drink. I'm going to choose a good head for drink. And that's purely because in real life I clearly lack business skills because I'm a podcaster. I know nothing about livestock rearing because I'm a vegan. I know nothing about hunting because I'm a vegan. But when I was a lad, I did have a good head for drink. I don't anymore because I'm so very old. The journey from Lutetia was uneventful. You looked splendid in your magnificent red sports chariot made in Mediolanum. Despite the price of fodder, which has risen steeply recently, you still have 35 sestertii in your purse. Got some money, and there's a little reference to the price of petrol going up. Classic. There is a picture which I believe is taken from Asterix and the Normans, showing the young Just for Kicks riding his sports chariot into the village and leaping out. Very much an affectionate parody of the young Blade with his naff little sports car. The man on guard outside the village gate dives for the ditch just in time. You are urging your horses on, full speed ahead to impress the villagers, but as you gallop through the gates, a wheel comes off your chariot, and crash! By Tutatis! You're not injured yourself, but the chariot is damaged. Hearing the noise, the villagers all run out, while you make your way towards Uncle Vital Statistics' house, feeling rather crestfallen. So that's a nice, simple introduction. You know me, I do like a terse and to the point introduction. Sets up the kind of character we are very neatly, with the reference to the little sports chariot, sets up the location we're going to, and gives us a tiny little reversal of fortune to immediately act as a kind of engine of narrative. Impedimenta welcomes you with open arms. You are always her favourite nephew. Just for Kicks, dear, how are you? You must be worn out after such a long journey. What a shame your uncle isn't here at the moment. Have you had anything to eat? There's a boar roasting this very minute. Or maybe you'd like a nice bath first. I'll just go and draw some water from the village well. There's no chance of making yourself scarce for the time being. You hug your aunt and make a decision. Do you want to avoid food and just have a bath? Or can you not resist Impedimenta's tempting suggestion? I will go for the food. It is always important to get stuck in to food whenever there is the opportunity. I fully believe this. How lucky you are to have an aunt who's such a good cook. The roast wild boar really is delicious. What a change from the stuff you usually eat in the Acutae Tabernae, Gallo-Roman fast food restaurants of Lutetia. The taste of the boar reminds you of hunting expeditions in the forest with your friends Asterix and Obelix. But an animated discussion interrupts your thoughts. You hear the tuneful voices of the fishmonger unhygienics and the blacksmith fully automatics. It sounds like there's going to be a good old-fashioned Gaulish punch-up. You can't resist this. Or maybe you've only had a boar and a half and you're still hungry. Too bad about the punch-up, you decide to finish your meal. So, of these options, I like the idea of going and witnessing a punch-up because slapstick is a big part of Asterix, and part of what makes the village so appealing is that they are very querulous, they're very bellicose, they're at each other's throats as often as they're at the Romans' throats, so I definitely want to get involved in that. One doesn't leave the table before the end of a meal, just for kicks. You haven't finished your second boar. Don't they teach you any manners in Lutetia these days? I won't have you fighting with those gutter snipes, says Impedimenta. You can't be rude to Impedimenta after such a good meal. Okay, so that wasn't really a choice. Looked like a choice, wasn't really a choice. After a little polite conversation with Impedimenta, who wants news of her family, your father's business, and the latest Lutetian fashions, you leave the house. In passing, your aunt slips some coins into your hand. Your pleasure is short-lived, only 5 sestertii, hardly worth a thing. Your country cousins seem to think you're still a little boy, or else they just don't know what prices are like in Lutetia. So I now have 40 sestertii, and really should be grateful to get anything. And we get a chance to go and join the fight anyway. Too late. All the Gauls get back to their feet, dust themselves down, adjust their clothing, and look nonchalant. A stranger has arrived in the village square. Unhygienics collects his fish, ready for next time. The stranger, a Gaul, walks over to the chief's house and announces, "A message for Chief Vital Statistics." Getafix steps forward. "Our chief's away for a few days," he says, but we can pass the message on. I just came to remind vital statistics that the traditional meeting between the chiefs of our two villages is to take place within our walls in 2 weeks' time, says the messenger. My chief would be very upset if your chief failed to turn up. He would assume that the friendship between us was at an end, and that an alliance with the Romans was inevitable, if not necessary. Getafix tries to explain, hoping at least to get a respite, but the messenger just turns his back and prepares to leave. This is too much for the wise old druid. Personally, he says, I think you're spouting a lot of hot air. We've never trusted chief whose morals are elastics, not since the business of the cauldron. See Asterix and the Cauldron. I'd like to know what he really has in mind. So we've got another choice. Do we want to follow our own initiative? Or do we want to go and ask Getafix to explain what's going on? However, the messenger's unexpected visit seems to put the druid in a bad temper. I'm liking the choices, giving a little bit more context than you might be used to in a fighting fantasy book, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because it's giving you a reason to do both options. I think I'm eager to use my own initiative. I think we'll follow the messenger from chief whose morals are elastics and try and find out a bit more. The messenger, turning to go back, takes the road which leads to the village of chief whose morals are elastics. It is perched on a cliff, several milia passum. The Romans measured distance in feet. 1 mille passum was 1,000 feet or 1 Roman mile. Thrilled by your own boldness, you follow him at a distance. You are just going through the village gates when you hear a faint creaking sound on your left near the fence. We've got a choice of 3 different options. We can go on following the messenger, taking more precautions by taking a skill test, or we can decide to tackle the messenger and talk to him, hoping to find out more about chief whose morals are elastics and the details of this strange meeting. Or you can stop following him and go to find out where the strange noise is coming from. Well, I think I will take a skill test to try and follow the messenger, but taking precautions. So my skill is 15. Say difficulty 4 skill test. So 4 dice, 3.5 per dice. Should be fine. It is not fine. I fail the skill test by 1. You follow the Gaul at a distance. The important thing is not to let him notice you. But of course, after going some way, you step on a dry twig. Crack. The messenger turns round. Since when have the Gauls spied on each other? He asks. I shall tell chief whose morals are elastics about this. Annoyed and unable to think of an answer, you go back to the village. In the village square, the villagers are all going about their business as usual. So I've got a choice. We can go and see Asterix and Obelix, Getafix the druid, Geriatrix, the village elder, back to Impedimenta, or if we know where vital statistics has gone, we can go and look for him. Well, I don't know where he's gone yet, so let's go and talk to Asterix and Obelix. Always nice to see the stars of the show. The house where Asterix and Obelix live is closed up. Your holiday is going to be rather dull without them. That's disappointing. You see, that's the thing where particularly aimed at children, what you want is to meet up with your favourite characters and to hopefully have them praise you and go, oh yes, you've done very well. So having them not in the story at all seems a little bit of a missed opportunity, but maybe we'll run into them somewhere down the line. So let's go and see Geriatrix because he's an old man and as a fighting fantasy aficionado, I do love an old man. There is a picture of Geriatrix, looking like an old man with a bald head and the traditional Gaulish moustache, and Uderzo's even more traditional big Gaulish nose. Gregoria, those were the days. I fought at Gregoria myself, you know. What a thrashing we gave the Romans. That was a battle, that was. The Battle of Gergovia. We didn't have any magic potion at Gergovia. No, indeed. I can still remember how we were besieged with Vercingetorix in our fortified town by the Romans. Caesar's armies were camping in the north of the town, and we couldn't get out to the south side because the town itself was built on cliffs. The Romans never managed to get in. What's more, young, just for kicks, some of us Gauls dug tunnels which came out on the other side of the rampart so that we could attack Caesar's troops by night without opening the town gates. Yes, Gergovia was quite something. Not like today's campaigning with magic potions and all mod cons. I feel sorry for the young folk of today. Here, see that sword above the hearth? That's the sword I fought with at Gergovia. I'll lend it to you if you like. Mind you take care of it. That sword was at Gergovia and it's seen more Romans than you have. I wouldn't mind going back to Gergovia someday, you know. I had a friend there. Local politics, his name was. He stayed on after the siege and started a little business. I should have done the same. See you again, young just for kicks. You must come and have a ball with us and I'll tell you about the Gallic War. Gergovia. What a battle that was. So we have our first item, a sword, and all we had to do to get it was listen to an interminable monologue about the good old days. Yep, very much an old man, present and correct. So I guess now we go and see Getafix. He was also technically an old man. Well, young just for kicks, I'm afraid your uncle's not at home, and nor are your friends Asterix and Obelix, says Getafix. Vital statistics hasn't been too well lately. It's his liver, you know. I advised him to take the waters at the hot springs of Aquae Calidae, where my colleague and the friend Druid Diagnostics runs a health farm. The chief set off for Aquae Calidae with Asterix and Obelix as an escort. However, he isn't back yet, even though the cure he was going to take must have finished several days ago. I'm worried. Vital Statistics has his traditional meeting with Chief whose morals are elastics, another village chief, in a fortnight's time. Chief whose morals are elastics gets on rather suspiciously well with the Romans. What's more, he's very touchy, and I'm afraid if Vital Statistics doesn't turn up at their meeting, he'll take it as an insult and an excuse to go over to the Romans. The present peace in Armorica is precarious anyway, and we would be in great danger then. Someone must go to Aquae Calidae to find your uncle. I only hope he's all right. So we've got two choices. Without a moment's hesitation, we could volunteer to go to Aquae Calidae and look for Chief Vital Statistics. Travel is good for the young. Or travel is good for the young, but so are holidays. You say you'd rather stay in the Gaulish village for the time being. An opportunity to refuse the call to adventure, and I am honour bound to always attempt to refuse the call to adventure, so I'll do the latter of these two options. What bad luck. This could have been the start of a fascinating, exciting story. Your adventure is over, but all the same you're sure to have a good holiday among your Gaulish friends. So we will invoke the sausage finger bookmark rule, as entirely expectedly deciding to stay at home ends the adventure. Always happy to see that as an option. And instead we'll volunteer to go and look for Uncle Vital Statistics. Spoken like a brave Gaul, young man, says the Druid, but you mustn't go without some magic potion. Here's a gourd full of the right stuff. Use it as you think best. And take this money too, you'll be needing funds. Here's a bag of food as well, and some torches. The most sensible way will be for you to go on foot to Condatum, where you can buy a horse or a chariot. So, you get a gourd of magic potion, 5 doses as explained earlier, 30 sestertii, 5 torches which count as one object, and a bag of food which must last the journey. And we are ready to embark upon our adventure. Chapter 2. An eventful start. I never know quite how I feel about dividing game books into chapters. On the one hand, it does make exploring an awful lot easier because you know that there's a limited amount of space for you to explore, but on the other hand, it does make games feel a little easy in some ways. Anyway, we are off, and there's a picture of Just for Kicks with a stick and a knapsack over his shoulder, setting off on his travels. Now, the artwork is obviously lovely because it's all stuff from previously published comic books, but it is still very pleasant to look at. So here you are, leaving the Gaulish village early in the afternoon, a bundle over your shoulder. You should be able to get hold of a horse or another chariot easily enough in Condatum. What a pity you've had to leave your own behind because of the smashing effect of your arrival in the village. Just before sunset you come to a small shady clearing. It looks like a good place to camp. We could eat some of the provisions that Getafix gave us. Seems straightforward. Or we could go hunting boar in the woods, which is a test of skill difficulty 4, which we can pass automatically if hunting is the secondary aptitude on our adventure slab. Instead of adventure sheet, we get an adventure slab because there's a running gag in Asterix that the only way of writing anything down is to carve it into a slab of stone, based on the fact that they didn't really have books, although they did have parchment. I think we'll try and go hunting for boar. Always hang on to your provisions for as long as possible. So again, it's another skill test I should pass. And I pass it easily. Soon after, you track down a young wild boar not much bigger than a piglet and roast it over your campfire. Oh, poor little boar. I feel bad. After your meal, you could really do with a snooze. You long for a rest. So, do we go to sleep on the grass of the clearing with your sword within reach? Or would you be safer up a tree? Or would you like to go on hoping to reach a village soon? Like, fictional tiredness isn't real, as opposed to real tiredness, which is kind of how I've felt since I turned 35. So, we'll shrug off the fictional tiredness much more easily than I shrug off real tiredness, and we'll press on, hoping to find a village. Night has fallen, and you haven't found a village or an inn yet. Worn out, you slow down, and you end up at a standstill in the middle of the forest. Do you want to lie down in the ditch by the roadside, or make one last effort and climb a tree to be in greater safety? Let's climb that tree. Getting a foothold on the rough bark of the trunk, you climb up into the branches of a great oak, make yourself a bed of leaves, and soon drop off to sleep. The climb was quite tricky. Have you been rash to set off on this adventure all by yourself with only a few sestertii in your purse? You fall asleep and dream of the dangers of the journey, wolves, brigands, even Romans if they find out what your mission is. "Gaul, I arrest you in the name of Caesar!" Wake up with a start. Phew, it was only a nightmare. All the same, take a test of skill, difficulty 4. So, we're looking for less than 15 on 4 dice. 14. Excellent. Perfectly average roll. If you succeed, you soon find you fall asleep again. Oof, you nearly fell. 2 large branches make a safer sort of bed. Now you can sleep soundly. Woken by the first rays of the sun, you climb down from your perch. The countryside is looking lovely. You will soon see your uncle and your friends Asterix and Obelix again, and you strike up a song you learned from Cacophonics. This old man, he played unum. This old man, he played duo. Right on up to this old man, he played mille quingenti, which is 1,500. As you get to this old man, he played mille quingenti, your stomach is rumbling with hunger. There doesn't seem to be much game in this part of the forest, and you decide to eat some of Getafix's provisions. Oh, your poor feet! It would be nice if a cart came along. Deep in such thoughts, you meet a peasant with a fork over his shoulder, and there is a picture of the pleasantly rotund and rustic-looking peasant with said fork indeed over his shoulder. And we can decide to walk on by ourselves, or he doesn't have a cart, but you'd like some company, and that is the option we will take. Seeing you, the man turns round. "Dang me, young fellow, my lad, if it bain't a real pleasure to meet company, by Belenos it be." You fall into conversation with him. You tell him about the high life of Lutetia, and he tells you about his prized cauliflowers and carrots. After a while, he asks you where you're going. What would you like to tell him? "I'm on my way to see my family in Lutetia. I'm going to do some shopping in Condatum, or I'm going to visit a friend in Aquae Calidae." We'll go with the last one, I think. We'll see whether he knows anything about Aquae Calidae that might be of assistance to us. I will say though, the design of this feels quite basic in some ways. The quality of the decisions we are being given does feel pretty high. "I bain't never heard of that there place," says the man. You explain that it's up in the mountains, and you part way at the next crossroads. Fair enough, a nice observation that, by and large, people in the past tended to be very much localised in one area and not travel a great deal. We're going on to the next chapter, which is exciting, but also this chapter was called An Eventful Start, and there's a whole bunch of exciting looking illustrations. Really, really exciting illustrations featuring fights with Romans and drinking competitions and an entire minigame set in a Roman camp that we've just completely bypassed with our decisions. So that's nice. Called An Eventful Start, actually. The events consisted of climbing a tree and meeting a farmer, which would be a very eventful day for me personally, but I feel as though in the context of an adventure story, maybe not as exciting as all that. Chapter 3, Pitfalls on the Way. Worn out, you arrive in Condatum early on in the evening. These barbarians call it a town. It's nothing but a big village. Lutetia's the only town in Gaul worth speaking of, but never mind that. Where will you stay tonight? At the Happy Boar or the Armorican Pancake? Well, the Gauls are completely obsessed with boars, so I'm going to go to the Happy Boar. Sitting at your table, you look around you. There are not many customers. Some Roman soldiers getting rather merry and a couple of Gaulish merchants. You're fed up with sandwiches. You're going to treat yourself to a proper meal. The innkeeper, a jovial soul, comes over and suggests one of his specialities. Boar in cream sauce, roast boar with garlic, or boar with mushrooms. I am a demon for both garlic and mushrooms, so my ideal would be a boar with garlic and mushrooms. But who doesn't love a big roast? So I'm going to go for the roast boar with garlic. The innkeeper's daughter brings you over your boar and a bowl of cider. The boar is a little overcooked for your liking, and there's rather too much garlic in it. Ain't no such beast. As far as I'm concerned, I am someone who generally, when something says use a clove of garlic, I assume what they really mean is use a bulb of garlic. You think nostalgically of Impedimenta's roast boar. Fussy about your food, aren't you? I mean, on one level, yes, I am, because I eat a very restrictive diet in that I'm both vegan and celiac, and therefore the list of things I can eat is very short. But within those limits, I think everything tastes nice. I'm one of those people who's never objected to anything on grounds of flavour. I just think food is nice. You finish up your boar. You've got choices of things to do. The Roman soldiers are playing dice. You can go over to their table. You could talk to the two Gauls. You could ask the innkeeper for a room, or strike up a conversation with his pretty daughter. Oh ho! With my minimal charm of 10, I think the pretty daughter is going to find me objectionable and smelling strongly of garlic. So that's out. But who doesn't love a little gambling mini-game in a game book? So let's go and bother the Roman soldiers who are playing dice. This is a very low-stress feeling game book. The Romans suggest a game of dice with you. There are 3 rounds to the game. Each player stakes 5 sestertii on each round. Thus, with 4 players, there are 20 sestertii on the table. Each player throws 3 dice, or throws the dice 3 times if you have only 1, and whoever gets the highest score wins the money. If there is a draw, the stakes are added to the next round of the game. If you decide to play, throw the dice first for each Roman soldier and finally for yourself. Once you have begun this game, you're not allowed to withdraw until you've played all 3 rounds. Well, let's gamble with the Romans. So, round 1. 3 Romans and me. So, first Roman, 14 to beat. Second Roman, 14 to beat. Third Roman, 10 to beat. Me, 10. I lose 5 sestertii, taking my total down to 65. Second round. First Roman, 12, 12 to beat. Second Roman. 10, third Roman. 7, 12 to beat. And I get, come on, I get 12. So that money now goes into the pot for the final round. So last round, exciting stuff this. First Roman, 8, that's good. Second Roman, 9, that's fine. Third Roman, 12, less good. So me, 15. Wow, so that means I actually win 40 sestertii, taking my total up to a whopping 100 sestertii. Luck be a lady tonight. If you have won at least 2 of the 3 rounds, we get sent to a particular paragraph where I guess they might decide to pick a fight. The Roman soldiers who are starting on their 3rd amphora of wine are giving you some rather nasty looks. When you prudently decide to walk away, one of them suddenly rises to his feet and bangs on the table. "Cheat! I saw him, he was cheating!" And his companions, rather drunk, back him up. "That's right, he was cheating. Give us our money back, thief." So options, we can give back the money. We can try and reason with them. "Hey, calm down, I didn't cheat, I was in luck, that's all." Or, you're not going to have a bunch of drunk legionaries do you down, rolling up your sleeves, you ask, "Who called me a cheat?" So that's the option we're going to go for, because this version of Just for Kicks is a fighty old lad. So, the 3 Romans fall on you shouting. As they are drunk, their fighting fitness is only 10 points each, 30 in all. The innkeeper watches the brawl in alarm and then intervenes to calm the combatants down and avoid damage to his inn. So, let's see if we win or lose. I have a fighting fitness of 20, and that's considerably less than 30, so I will need a degree of luck. I think there's only one obvious thing to do here, and that is to take a big old swig of magic potion and win the fight automatically. The startled innkeeper sees you knock out 3 legionaries with a single blow. Once the fight is over, he comes up to you, tearing his hair. "You're mad," he says. "You'll bring the whole patrol down on us, and look at the state you've left my place in." Then he calms down a bit. "Well, never mind, considering the state they're in themselves. I shouldn't have any trouble persuading them that they did all this damage fighting each other, but you can still pay me for the table and chairs you've smashed. That's 50 sestertii worth of damage, that is, and you can go and spend the rest of tonight somewhere else. I don't want any trouble with the Roman army." So we have to hand over the 50 sestertii that we've won and leave the inn grumbling. Easy come, easy go. And on that bombshell, I think we will break off the recording there. I'm going to go away and play through the relatively slender remainder of Asterix, the Meeting of the Chieftains, on my own time. I've had some fun with it, with a few little reservations, which I'm sure I will talk about in my closing remarks, which are coming up for you in just a couple of seconds. Tatty bye. I'm aware some people like to know how my playthrough ends after the recording finishes. I'm delighted to be able to tell you that on this occasion it turns out that I definitely shouldn't have been so honest with the travelling farmer, since he's a Roman spy, and that really came back to bite me in the bottom once I got to Aquae Calidae. There's a lesson there, and it's don't trust country folk. I'm pretty sure I did play this book when it came out, which means that for me it's tied up with a certain amount of nostalgia that makes it harder to gauge the quality properly. I think, though, as far as tie-in gamebooks go, this is one of the better ones in terms of the functional design, but reading it, I'm a little bit disappointed in how it doesn't quite feel like an Asterix story. The thing it reminds me of the most is Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland film, a movie that asks the question, what if Alice in Wonderland was restructured to make it feel like a video game? A question, honestly, no one was really asking. The Meeting of the Chieftains is doing something similar. It generates some tremendous ludic moments, and the aesthetic and the tropes of the Asterix series are present, but they never manage to mesh into something that feels as though it's a part of the world of Asterix. I can't fault the author for including a plethora of silly names, multiple punch-ups, and the odd reference to modern life as viewed through the lens of the year 50 BC, but at no point does it capture the glorious chaos that is a good Asterix adventure. Part of this is simply a disjunction between the demands of how gamebooks function and how the comedy of Asterix functions. A joke is fundamentally a surprise. It's something that creates a tension which is resolved in an unusual way. Even slapstick has to hew to this. Someone getting punched in the face is not funny in and of itself. Something about how the person is punched in the face or how they react to being punched in the face has to be unexpected. Sometimes it's simply a question of who gets punched in the face. Often with slapstick, the humour derives from how excessive violence is combined with a lack of actual enduring consequence. You definitely get that in Asterix, with Romans constantly being pummeled, but always walking away with comedically oversized bruises and bumps, rather than serious concussions and life-changing internal injuries. That's hard to convey with dice. Combat systems in games are not funny in and of themselves. They can generate humour. They can generate lots of humour. The first time I played Battletech with my husband, we settled down to get stuck into a long, drawn-out, attritional firefight, but then his first shot of the game caused one of my mechs to instantly explode. Now that was hilarious, especially since Battletech usually takes forever to play, but you can't plan for it with your system. And what that means is that a thing that in the comics is the source of tremendous humour just becomes this functional gamebook exercise, and they don't sit well together. Another element that features strongly in Asterix is character work. That's another thing that gamebooks struggle with. Gamebooks can be quite solipsistic in that they are very focused on the player and trying to make their experience feel real. You also want to generally get to decisions as quickly as possible because reading long passages is really detrimental to immersion. So you have a combination of focusing on the reader as the only really important character and not having the space to devote to character work. That means that you can't do any sort of repartee, and one-liners are kind of difficult because too often the setup involves putting words into the player's mouth, and that also affects immersion. That's not to say you can't do humour in gamebooks. You can do humour in gamebooks fine. You can do humorous characters in gamebooks perfectly well as well. The late great J.H. Brennan managed to make his Grail Quest books quite funny through a combination of amusing situations, very overdone characters, and an easy authorial voice that presents the book as being in conversation with the reader. His humour was silly, but he loved a good pun or a bad pun, and he had a knack for finding things that resonated with kids. He would have been, I think, a remarkably good fit in many ways for writing an Asterix gamebook. The only downside would have been that he definitely wouldn't have done more than the bare minimum of research, and he'd also have knocked out the entire thing in one draft. So there would have been the significant possibility that Asterix might have ended up going into space or fighting a dinosaur or whatever. There are a few moments in the meeting of the Chieftains that raised a smile, but they are kind of few and far between. Now, the artwork being thieved from the comics definitely helps, but it also reminds you that charming as the artwork is, it was funnier in the original context. One thing I want to mention about the artwork is the quantity of the art has an interesting effect in that it's constantly teasing you about other things that might be happening. You've got single panels from the comics scattered across the pages, and with this being a magazine-sized book, that means most pages have 3 or 4 bits of art visible. And this art being sort of vibrant comic art and full colour really draws the eye. And I really like the effect this has because it's constantly letting you know just little hints of what's going on elsewhere in the story. One thing that gamebook art does well when you're flipping through a fighting fantasy book looking for the next paragraph, you will catch glimpses of these wonderful full-page illustrations that make you think, oh, I wonder how I find that encounter. And the sheer quantity of art here makes that feel even more impactful, I think. Of course, it would be better if it were bespoke art, but hey-ho, you can't have everything. Part of what undercuts the meeting of the Chieftains is that there's nothing especially funny about the premise. You need to go and find chief vital statistics, and the adventure unfolds as a travelogue through a few faintly familiar locations. There's no central idea animating this story, and so it just becomes a series of events that are occasionally mildly amusing. I think this is at least partly down to the constrictions when working on someone else's property. You can't create anything new because that would be treading on the toes of the main creatives, and you've barely got an art budget anyway, so you're simply left with remixing what already exists. I think you would struggle to pitch what if Asterix went to the North Pole, or what if the Romans made their own magic potion, and that's a shame, because it does trammel this story into a few familiar places and doesn't give a lot of scope for actual creativity. And that's a shame, because the writing isn't without a modicum of charm. Now, those are my big complaints out of the way, and actually I did rather enjoy playing The Meeting of the Chieftains. As an Asterix book, it doesn't really work, but as a game book, there's lots in there to enjoy. Firstly, it feels like a premium product, even if some of that is smoke and mirrors thanks to the reused artwork. It's the same size as a standard Asterix book, and full colour with a lovely fold-out character sheet that you can actually see at the same time as reading the rest of the book. It's nicely designed and feels very pleasant to play. It's also deceptively long, with 334 sections, which is more than many spin-off books manage, so you actually get a proper game book for your money rather than a simple choose-your-own-adventure. The sections are all extremely short because space is at a premium, which is one of the things that makes, I think, the humour hard to include. It's so tightly written that there's just not many spare words once the functional text has been included, but the author does do their best and the art does lift it a bit. This is very much a game book rather than a choose-your-own-adventure book, and that makes the game side feel better developed than in many spin-off titles. Although the quest feels a bit low-key and at times a bit aimless, there's some lovely set pieces along the way, and I very much enjoyed how the author has managed to create some imaginative mini-games that take advantage of the art. There's several places where the art, the only new art as far as I can see, takes up an entire page. There's a Roman camp at the start and the town of Gergovia at the end. Both of these play out almost like a hybrid board game and game book, with you moving around a location according to some simple rules, then breaking off to go and do small encounters along the way. Both of them have an optimal path, but the one at the start is fairly forgiving, while the latter one is much harder, which makes sense for the climax of the book. It's a really neat idea. It plays out beautifully, though there's a few questions maybe over the balance in the Gergovia section. I really enjoyed how these elements revelled in the visual real estate that the magazine-sized format allows. They're much more pleasant to engage with than similar sorts of things we've seen in some of the more traditional paperback-sized game books. Of course, I didn't manage to get to the camp minigame in my recorded playthrough because I opted to have the least exciting second act possible. I have an uncanny knack of avoiding the best bits of books when I play them out loud. If I'd been the protagonist of Star Wars, it would have wound up being a story about a farm boy who stays on the farm and fixes droids for beer money in his spare time. It's a shame because the minigame is a lot of fun and I think would have worked fairly well on Mike as well. It has you sneaking through a Roman camp and exploring tents to try and find your gear which has been taken by the Romans. You've got your lovely full-colour board to move across with Roman guards to avoid or fight, and there's a whole bunch of tents, each with a little encounter tied to them. It's easy to parse and there's just enough strategy to be interesting. Creeping into tents, not knowing what you'll find and worrying about raising the alarm creates a tremendous sense of tension, and it's a highlight of the early adventure, so of course I made a beeline in exactly the opposite direction on my playthrough. There's also a darts minigame which is great and involves dropping a pencil from 50 centimetres above a diagram of a dartboard, with a brilliant extra rule that you have to add 20 centimetres to the distance if you got into a drinking competition with a Roman earlier. You can also play it with a dice if you aren't able to drop things because you're on public transport or whatever, which is a sensible touch. All of these bits feel enjoyable, and the mechanics generally make sense, which is always nice. Elsewhere, though, the core mechanical elements feel functional but not inspired, and I'm more or less okay with that. I think if I were designing it, I'd maybe want to do little D6 tables to roll on for each fight with some silly and over-the-top descriptions of what happens with each result, but this certainly works. I mean, it is kind of what all role-playing combat systems ultimately default to, which is you just knock random amounts of health off each other in turn until one of you runs out of health. Fine. You can drag a bit of tension out of the combat system by messing with whether or not you get a chance to heal between fights. And you've also got the magic potion as a limited resource that can be turned to in a pinch. If you've been profligate with the potion at the start, I have to say the end game is going to be very hard, but that is no bad thing, especially as you can avoid a lot of the fights. The fights don't feel especially interesting, and a high fighting fitness is going to be much more useful than a high charm. But again, there's nothing especially wrong with that. I think having a system where you kind of go on your first playthrough, oh, I've made some mistakes, one of these stats is much better than all the others, is actually okay. You wouldn't want it in every game book, and you wouldn't want it in a tabletop role-playing game, but here, that's fine. I haven't been through to see what the minimum number of fights is, but there's quite a lot of variability in the second half that will have an impact, so if you get unlucky, you are going to want to have as much magic potion as possible on hand. And the underlying system for testing your charm or your skill, roll a bunch of d6 against a stat and try and get below it, that's a perfectly serviceable system. I like that it's got a kind of built-in difficulty thing with the number of dice. That's fine. It's sort of like a reverse original Star Wars role-playing game system where you would generate a pool of dice and roll them and add them together, and then the GM would generate a difficulty number. And here, you've generated a difficulty number, and the book is generating the number of dice you have to roll. It's the same thing, just gone back to front. Interesting, I like it. The secondary aptitudes are also fine, although there's only one opportunity to use each of them, I think. And there's one place where 2 different aptitudes will help, which feels a little bit redundant. Did you actually need 4, or would 3 have been fine? I think 3 would have been fine. Ultimately, it's just a nice little bonus system. Doesn't add much, but it's just another little twist. Nice to see. One thing the book does do really well is kind of pacing and escalation. The opening feels extremely low stakes. It's a great introduction to this is how game books work. There's very little chance you'll come a cropper. On the other hand, the finale is surprisingly nail-biting. The chapter system helps with this as well. I think it's something that probably assisted the designer as they were putting the book together, because it kind of gives you an incentive to make sure that areas don't expand to fill too much space. If you know there's 5 chapters, you're kind of incentivized to make sure that each of them has enough stuff in to feel like a proper area. When page and word count are at a premium, these are good ways to make sure you're working to keep things tight. Another highlight for me is the choices. I always like it when the text gives you a little reason for making each choice. It's something I try and do in my books, making it so that most decisions have at least something to recommend them. I mean, occasionally you are going to want to make it pretty clear that there's a right answer and a wrong answer. But in general, I think it's good to try and provide some kind of rationale for making either decision. There's a particularly nice moment later on when you're trying to pull off a disguise, and the text just straight up asks you whether you think the Romans are going to buy your disguise. And that's quietly, intensely subversive design. Being me, I immediately decided that my efforts to pass myself off as a local would be rubbish. It ended badly, of course, but what else would you expect? But it opens up this kind of intriguing design space where you give the option to fail certain tasks, and you can put in interesting, potentially even positive consequences from messing up. It's something I might try and explore in my next book. As someone who specialises in messing up and frequently messing up in public, I'm all in favour. I think you have to be careful not to end up telling the player too much about what their perspective on the world is, because you want to leave scope for players to draw their own conclusions about what's going on in the world, but handled judiciously, I think it adds rather than detracts from the sense of immersion. So that's Meeting of the Chieftains. It's not going to set the world alight, but it's a very nice object, and it did remind me how much I loved Asterix as a child, so that's pleasant. It's a very solid gamebook. It's worth playing, just for the little mini-games that elevate it to something much more interesting than the average spin-off gamebook. I just wish it felt a bit more like an Asterix comic. It's so close to being a sort of surprise classic, but sadly falls at potentially the most important hurdle. That is all for this episode. Before I go, I have the pleasant duty to thank a returning patron, Pat, for his continued support. Pat, thank you so much. Your support really is appreciated. I'll be back in a week or two with the big 5-0. That's right, we're going back to Firetop Mountain and seeing what's changed since we were last there. I bet he's got an air fryer. Everyone has an air fryer. This will be an interesting look, too, at where the series started and where it's ended up. 50 books in the series. I can't imagine that when they started with Warlock of Firetop Mountain, they thought it would be running 50 volumes later. Anyway, if you'd like to get in touch with me in the meantime, you can email me at hjdoomretrofun, all one word, @gmail.com, or you can follow me on Blue Sky at hjdoom. Thank you very much for listening. Take care, and I'll see you soon.